In the spring of 1887, my husband John cut down the last old-growth pine on our 100 acres. It was a giant, for men wide at its base, and when it fell, the ground of our valley shook as if in grief. I felt the tremor in the floorboards of our cabin, a mile away. He had bought the land with my inheritance. A hillside of ponderosa and fir, aspen and oak, so thick and ancient the sun was a rumor on the forest floor. He saw only board feet. He saw a fortune. For 2 years, the saw screamed from dawn to dusk. The air grew thick with the scent of pine sap and ruin. I watched the hillside bleed itself bare. First the giants fell. Then the middling trees. Then everything else, until all that remained was a raw, red wound of earth bristling with stumps. A graveyard. The money from the timber was supposed to build us a grand house, set us up as founders of the town growing in the gulch below. But the railroad spur washed out. The lumber prices fell. The money vanished into saloon debts and bad card games. A month after the last tree fell, John was killed. A loose chain, a rolling log, the foreman said. They brought him home on a wagon, wrapped in a canvas sheet. He left me with nothing but a field of stumps and the scorn of a town that had watched his ambition curdle into folly. He left me with the silence where a forest used to be. I was 24 years old. A widow. The owner of 100 acres of ghosts. The land was a debt. A monument. The people in Providence Gulch looked at me with a mix of pity and contempt. I was the fool's wife, left to sit on the fool's wasteland. They called the place Hayes's Folly in the general store. Conversations would stop when I walked in. Women would pull their children a little closer, as if failure were a contagion. My world had been stripped to the bone. The wind, which once whispered through pine needles, now howled across the exposed slope, peeling away the thin topsoil. When it rained, the water didn't soak in. It ran in brown, muddy torrents down the hill, carving deep gullies, carrying the last of the land's life down into the creek, choking it. The sun beat down on the stumps, bleaching them white like bones. There was no life. No birdsong. No scuttling squirrels. No shade. Just the stumps, thousands of them, standing in silent accusation. For a year, I did nothing. I existed in the small cabin at the foot of the barren hill, a prisoner of John's mistake. I would sit on the porch and stare at the devastation until the shapes of the stumps swam in my vision. Each one was a headstone. Each one marked a death. My grief was as barren and exposed as that hillside. The town expected me to sell it for pennies, to move away, to disappear. And most days, I wanted to. But one afternoon, chased indoors by a dust storm the likes of which the valley had never seen before the trees were gone, I climbed into the small, hot attic. I was looking for blankets, but I found a trunk. It was old, bound in leather, with my mother's family name, Arthur, burned into the wood. It had belonged to my grandfather. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten woolens, were his notebooks. Dozens of them, bound in oilcloth. They were not diaries. They were a testament. For 40 years, my grandfather had walked this land. He had mapped every spring, every seep, every game trail. He had catalogued the trees, not as lumber, but as beings. Ponderosa pine, 200 years old, home to a family of horned owls. Quaking aspen grove, north slope, first to green in the spring. He sketched the ferns that grew in the damp shade, the mushrooms that followed the autumn rains, the specific mosses that favored the north side of the rocks. He had recorded the depth of the soil, the way the snow lingered on the upper slopes, the way the forest floor held water like a sponge, releasing it slowly, steadily, all summer long. His handwriting was precise, his observations clinical yet filled with a deep, abiding reverence. He was a scientist of the soul of a place. I sat on the dusty floorboards, the wind rattling the window panes, and I read for hours. I read until the light failed. I saw the hill not as it was, but as he had seen it. A living, breathing system. A cathedral built by time and water and sun. And then I found the passage, on the last page of the last notebook, written in a shaky hand, as if he knew his time was short. They will come for the trees, he wrote. Men with eyes that see only dollars will come. They will not understand that to take the trees is to take the water. To take the water is to take the soil. To take the soil is to take the future. To take is easy. It is the work of a moment. He left a space. Then, the final line. To return is the work of a lifetime. That night, for the first time in a year, I did not dream of stumps. I dreamed of shade. And a mission took root in the barren ground of my heart. The land remembers, I thought. And I would help it remember. A week later, a man knocked on my door. He was old, his back bent, his hands gnarled like oak roots. I recognized him. Jacob. He had been the foreman of John's logging crew. He held his hat in his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice a low rasp. I ain't expecting you to be pleased to see me. I said nothing. I just waited. He took a ragged breath. What we did to that hill, it was a crime. A crime against God and nature both. John, he had a fever in him. A gold fever, but for timber. And we all caught it. We worked like devils, and we turned that paradise into a hell. He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a terrible, ancient shame. I can't sleep for the sound of the saws. For the sound of that last big one coming down. I was the one who set the charge to split the stump. We broke it. We broke it all. He looked past me, at the ruined landscape. This valley's getting drier. Did you notice? The creek's lower than I've ever seen it. The dust. It wasn't like this before. We did that. I found my voice. Why are you here, Jacob? To work, he said simply. I ain't got money to give you. But I got this. He held up his calloused hands. I helped take it. I want to help put it back. If you'll have me. I'll work for my soul's own peace, not for pay. He was the first person who didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with the shared guilt of a survivor. The work is impossible, I told him. I know, he said. Let's start anyway. He was my first and only ally. The work began. It was not romantic. It was brutal. My grandfather's notebooks were my map, my scripture. Jacob's practical knowledge was my engine. First, the debris. For months, we did nothing but clear the slash, the discarded branches, the shattered tops, the acres of woody refuse left behind. We piled it and, on still, damp mornings, we burned it. The smoke hung over the valley, a funereal pyre for the forest that was. The townspeople complained about the smell. Then, the stumps. Thousands of them. Some we could pry out with long levers, Jacob and I straining against the wood until our muscles screamed. The bigger ones, the giants, were impossible. Jacob, who had once used dynamite to clear them, now used an axe and a shovel, patiently, doggedly, to chip away at their edges, to expose their roots, to encourage their decay. It was penance, one splinter at a time. We started a nursery. Down by the creek, in the one patch of decent soil that remained, we built cold frames. I used the last of my money to order seeds. Not from a catalogue. I wrote letters to universities in the East, to botanists my grandfather had mentioned in his notes. I begged for acorns from the oaks of the Ohio Valley, for the seeds of the hardy Scotch pine, for the feathery seeds of the tamarack. They arrived in small paper packets. They felt like dust in my palm. It seemed a pathetic answer to such a monumental loss. We planted them in trays. We watered them with buckets hauled from the creek. We watched. Most did not sprout. The ones that did were fragile, thin as thread. Every morning I would go out, expecting to find them withered or eaten. The town watched us. They saw a grieving widow and a guilt-ridden old man engaged in a fool's errand. Planting ghosts, they called it. The store owner, Mr. Henderson, shook his head as he sold me a new shovel. Amelia, there's good land to be had in the next valley over. Why break your back on this wasteland? This is my land, I would say. It was the only answer I had. By the end of the second year, we had a few hundred seedlings. Pines, mostly. A handful of oaks. They were barely a foot high. We chose a 10-acre patch on the north slope, where my grandfather's note said the soil was deepest. We dug the holes. One by one. In the hard, clay-packed, sun-baked earth. My hands, which had once known embroidery, were now masses of callus and scar. Jacob's slow, steady rhythm was a comfort. Dig. Plant. Water. Tamp. Move 6 feet. Repeat. We planted 500 trees that first autumn. By the next summer, half were dead. The sun had scorched them. The wind had snapped them. Gophers had chewed their roots. I wept with a despair so profound it felt like my first grief all over again. The land is still angry, Jacob said, his voice quiet. We have to prove we're serious. So we started again. We hauled mulch, wagonload by wagonload, to protect the base of each seedling. We built small stone windbreaks. We planted the survivors farther apart. We learned the land's cruel new language. The motto from my grandfather's book became a prayer whispered against the dust and the heat. To return is the work of a lifetime. We were only in the first few years of that lifetime. We had to endure. By the 5th year, something shifted. A section of the hill, when viewed from the cabin, no longer looked naked. It was covered in a faint, greenish-blue haze. The pines we had planted in that first desperate autumn, the ones that had survived, were now as tall as I was. Their roots were taking hold. I walked the rows one evening as the sun set. The air was still. Jacob was there, mending a fence line. He stopped and watched me touch the needles of a young ponderosa. It's starting to breathe again, he said, coming to stand beside me. I wasn't sure it ever would, I admitted. My voice was thick. It remembers, he said, looking up the slope. It's slow. But it remembers what it's supposed to be. That year, for the first time, I saw a rabbit dart between the young trees. A pair of bluebirds nested in an oak sapling that was barely more than a shrub. These small signs of life were triumphs. They were validations more potent than any human praise. The town's mockery had faded to a quiet, baffled indifference. Amelia's folly was now just Amelia's hill. They left me to my strange obsession. The work expanded. We didn't just plant trees. We followed my grandfather's maps. We found the places where springs had once been, now just damp patches of mud. We planted willows and cottonwoods there, water-loving trees whose roots would anchor the soil and purify the ground. We terraced the steepest slopes, laying stones and logs to slow the runoff, to force the rain to sink in, to stay. We were reteaching the land how to drink. By the 10th year, the first trees we planted were 20 feet high. They were beginning to create their own shade. Beneath them, the soil was no longer baked clay. It was darker. A thin layer of fallen needles was becoming humus. Ferns, unplanted by us, began to unfurl in the cool shadows. The seeds had been there all along, dormant, waiting. By the 15th year, the upper half of the hill was a young forest. Walking through it, the air was cooler. The wind was a murmur, not a howl. We had planted over 50,000 trees. Pine, fir, spruce, oak, aspen, birch. We had lost count of how many had died. But tens of thousands had lived. Deer returned to the valley, finding shelter on the hill. I heard the call of a horned owl one night, and I sat on my porch and cried, not from sorrow, but from a joy so fierce it was painful. The hill was no longer a graveyard. It was a nursery. And then the drought came. It didn't arrive like a storm, it crept in. A dry spring in 1899. A summer of relentless, brassy sun. The winter that followed brought little snow. The next spring, the creek that ran through Providence Gulch was a trickle. By summer, it was a cracked, muddy scar. The town's wells began to fail. First the shallow ones, then the deeper ones. Cattle grew thin. Kitchen gardens withered. Dust was a constant presence, a fine grit in every meal, in every breath. Fear, for the first time, settled over the valley. A fear more primal than market crashes or bad luck. A fear of thirst. My hill was different. It had become an island of green in a sea of brown. The years of work, the terracing, the mulching, the deep roots of the growing forest, they had transformed the land. The hill had become a sponge, just as my grandfather had written. It caught and held what little rain and snow fell, drawing it deep into the earth instead of letting it run off. One morning in August, Jacob came to the cabin, his eyes wide. "Amelia, you need to see this." He led me up the slope, into the heart of the 20-year-old forest we had planted. He took me to a hollow I knew well, a place where my grandfather's map had marked a seasonal seep. It had been a patch of mud for as long as I'd known it. But now, it was more. From beneath a moss-covered rock, a steady, clear stream of water was flowing. It wasn't a torrent, but it was constant. It trickled down through the ferns, cool and clean, forming a small pool before disappearing back into the rich earth. The forest we had planted had healed the land so deeply that it had resurrected a spring. 2 weeks later, they came. A delegation from the town. The mayor, Mr. Henderson the store owner, and a half-dozen other men who had once called my land a folly. They stood at the edge of my property, hats in hand, their faces grim with worry and humbled pride. The mayor, a man named Peterson, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hayes. Amelia. We have a problem." "I can see that," I said, my gaze sweeping over the parched valley below. He shuffled his feet. "Our wells are dry. The creek is gone. We have water for maybe another week. We're hauling it in by wagon, but it's not enough." He paused, and the silence was heavy. "We've heard a rumor that you have water up on your hill." Mr. Henderson spoke up, his voice cracking. "Amelia, we were wrong. All of us. We laughed. We called you a fool. But we were the fools. We didn't see. We're asking, begging, can we have some of your water? Just enough to get through." I looked at their faces. I saw no mockery now. Only desperation. I thought of the years of scorn. I thought of the lonely work, the calloused hands, the aching back. A part of me, a small, hard part, wanted to say no. But then I looked up at the hill. At the green canopy, the life, the cool, shaded air. I looked at the water, a gift from the land we had healed. It was not my water. It belonged to the hill. And the hill was part of the valley. To take is easy, I said, my voice quiet. To return is the work of a lifetime. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the assent in my tone. "Yes," I said. "You can have water." The discovery of the spring changed everything. My quiet, solitary life was over. The town, in its desperation, treated my hill with a newfound reverence. They organized water brigades, men and women carefully carrying buckets down from the spring, ensuring not a drop was wasted. They followed my rules without question, sticking to the paths, not disturbing the young trees. They were guests in a sanctuary they had once scorned. The news of the widow's forest and its miraculous spring traveled. One day, a man from the state capital arrived in a buckboard. His name was Mr. Davies, a geologist from the university. He was a man of science, with spectacles and a notebook, and a skeptical but curious air. He asked if he could survey my land. For a week, he walked the hill, often with me at his side. He took soil samples. He measured the depth of the leaf litter. He charted the growth of the trees. He was fascinated by my grandfather's notebooks, which I showed him. He treated them not as folksy journals, but as the invaluable scientific record they were. On his final day, he sat with me on my porch, his own notebook filled with calculations and observations. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice filled with professional awe. What you have accomplished here is, from an ecological standpoint, staggering. You haven't just planted trees. You have engineered an entire watershed. These folk methods, this terracing, this careful species selection, it's a living model for reclamation. You have literally manufactured water in the middle of a catastrophic drought. He wrote a report. It was published in academic journals and reprinted in newspapers across the West. Hayes's folly was now the Providence miracle. Scientists and government men came to see it. They came to learn. I was no longer a strange widow. I was an expert, an oracle of the earth. The town, with state assistance, hired an engineer to help them find a more permanent water solution. His name was Samuel. He came to Providence Gulch to drill new, deeper wells, but he spent most of his time on my hill. He was a quiet man, with kind eyes and hands that understood the mechanics of the world, both metal and earth. Unlike the other visitors, he wasn't there to study my success. He was there to understand its heart. He walked the paths with me, not asking about hydrology, but about the names of the birds. He helped me clear a new firebreak, his movement strong and sure. He didn't see a miracle, he saw 20 years of hard, devoted work. We talked for hours. About my grandfather's vision. About John's tragic ambition. About Jacob's quiet penance. Jacob had passed away a few years prior, his work done, his soul, I believe, at peace. Samuel listened. One evening, as we watched the sunset paint the tops of the pines, he turned to me. "You didn't just rebuild a forest, Amelia," he said. "You rebuilt a future." He never left Providence Gulch. He stayed, first as a friend, then as a partner. We were married a year later, a small ceremony under the shade of the oldest oaks we had planted. He was my companion in the second half of the work. We were no longer just planting. We were tending, pruning, selectively harvesting to allow the stronger trees to thrive. The forest was our life's work, our child, our legacy. I am gone now. I lived a long life, long enough to see the saplings we planted become giants. Long enough to see their children sprout in the rich, dark soil of the forest floor. I saw the creek in the valley flow year-round again, fed by the steady, clean runoff from our hill. I saw Providence Gulch survive and thrive, its people forever changed by a thirst that led them to humility. Samuel and I are buried on the hill, beneath a ponderosa pine that stands 200 feet tall. It was one of the first we planted, a frail seedling I had almost given up on. There is a simple stone, and on it, Samuel had carved the words I had requested. Amelia Hayes. She returned what was taken. My story is written in the rings of the trees, in the depth of the soil, in the clarity of the water. It is a story of ruin and of slow, patient restoration. And now, I speak to you. From this place of shade and memory. Look at your own life. What is the barren ground you have been given? What is the hillside in your soul that has been stripped bare by loss, by mistake, by the careless greed of this world? What is your field of stumps? Do you sit on the porch and curse the silence? Do you stare at the ghosts of what was and let the dust of despair settle over you? Or do you see the one thing that remains? The ground itself. The potential. The memory of what it was, which is also the promise of what it can be. The work is not easy. It will break your back. It will break your heart, again and again. The sun will be relentless. The wind will try to tear your work apart. The seeds of hope will seem like insignificant dust. People will call you a fool. But the land remembers. Your soul remembers. What was once whole can be made whole again. Not by a miracle. But by work. By patience. By showing up, day after day, with a shovel and a seed and a belief in the slow, inexorable power of return. To take is easy. It is the work of a moment. To return is the work of a lifetime. Find your barren ground. And begin.